Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first presentation of the new year. This is the Grand Canyon Historical Society and our first virtual outing in the month of January. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And tonight we're very pleased to welcome Jeremy Beer, who will talk about one of the most important Southwestern explorers there ever were, and probably one that many of us are not familiar with. But we're going to learn about Francisco Garces, the missionary explorer, tonight. Just before we get started, I want to share with you a little information about the Historical Society. There's our mission statement. The Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of our members and the public. And we are an official park partner for Grand Canyon National Park. If you are not a member, we highly encourage you to do so. Our dues are only $35 a year. Our quarterly journal, which used to be called The Old Pioneer, we've just changed the name for this next issue. It's going to be called Grand Canyon History, formerly The Old Pioneer. We are an all-volunteer organization. Nobody here gets paid to do this. We do this for our love of the Grand Canyon and the region in which it is located. And our website is very easy to peruse, grandcanyonhistory.org, and you can click there to join or donate. I'm very, very happy to introduce PhD Jeremy Beer. He's an author and historian, and I attended a meeting of the Flagstaff Corral of Westerners a couple of months ago, saw Jeremy's presentation, and knew that it would be a really good one for the Historical Society. Jeremy is a founding partner of the American Philanthropic in Phoenix and the author of 8 books, which includes the topic that we're going to be hearing about tonight, Beyond the Devil's Road, Francisco Garces and the Spanish Encounter with the American Southwest. I have finished reading Jeremy's book, and if you love Southwestern history, Spanish colonial history, Native American history, this is a treasure trove of geography and exploration in the American Southwest. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Jeremy Beer, who's going to talk to us tonight about this amazing explorer of the Southwest.
Um, well, here we are. So we're going to take you back 250 years to begin here. January 13th, 1776, 250 years ago today, what was going on? Well, on the eastern seaboard of our vast continent, Great Britain was at war with the American colonists, of course. General George Washington was laying siege to Boston, and the British Navy was bombarding strategic locations to the south. And far, far to the west, roughly 200 Spanish men, women, and children were encamped at Mission San Gabriel. Today, that mission is 10 miles east of Los Angeles, but to those Spaniards, it was an oasis in an unknown and frightening land. The group's leader was named Juan Bautista de Anza. He was leading this group of people, known to history as the Second Anza Expedition, to a place in Alta California, in Spanish, of course, called Our California, Alta California, a place that the Spanish called Monterey. Monterey was still some 350 miles distant, but the group had already come much further than that. Amazingly, although it had trudged through some of the continent's most inhospitable terrain, it had lost only one member, a woman who had died tragically during childbirth between Tubac and San Javier del Bac. Everyone else would ultimately make it to Monterey alive. There, the group's members would become California's first true Spanish colonists, the progenitors of those Californios who, for better or worse, planted European civilization on the Pacific coast. There would have been no so-called Second Anza Expedition in 1775-76, no First Anza Expedition in 1774, and perhaps no Spanish emigration to Alta California for many years thereafter, were it not for a quiet, unassuming Franciscan friar that had traveled from Tubac to Yuma with the rest of the group. And that friar's name was Francisco Garces. I wrote a Life and Times biography of Garces, as Wayne just mentioned, titled Beyond the Devil's Road that was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in late 2024. Around the same time, I wrote a shorter magazine piece about Garces that the editors titled America's Greatest Explorer. Man, I wish I had had the chutzpah to give that title to my book. I'm sure I would have sold many more copies. Was Garces truly the greatest explorer of the land now known as the United States? I don't know that I could in good conscience go quite that far, but I also think it might be true. Garces's explorations were in many ways unparalleled. Not so much for the distances he covered, although the distances he covered were vast, but perhaps more so because of the courage and the spirit with which they were undertaken. Both were, for their time, truly unique. Of course, he is important to this group, the Grand Canyon Historical Society, because of his significant association with the Grand Canyon, so we'll be sure to linger on that topic. In the rest of my time with you, I'll cover very quickly three things: who Garces was, what he did and why, that's number two, and third, why it mattered. So I hope you'll agree by the time I'm done yapping at you here tonight that it was worth your time to get to know this remarkable and almost completely forgotten man. All right, so who was Francisco Garces? Let me answer that question first by just rattling off some of the adjectives used by historians to describe him over the years: hardy, warm-hearted, down-to-earth, peerless, filled with abundant energy and ambition. The historian Herbert Bolton said that no one could surpass Garces in courage. Now, keep in mind that whatever else one might think of the Spaniards of Garces's time and place, they tended to be a courageous lot, so that was saying something. It was because I kept encountering these kinds of judgments that I undertook to write a Garces biography. A man who garners such accolades, I figured, is worth knowing. Francisco Garces was born to a peasant family in a tiny village near Zaragoza, Spain, in the province of Aragon, in 1738. At the age of 15, he joined the order of friars minor, the Franciscans. 8 years later, shortly after he was ordained a priest, he encountered two recruiters from the Colegio de Santa Cruz, which was located in Querétaro, Mexico. The recruiters were looking for Franciscans to join the Colegio and ultimately serve in the New Spain mission field. Garces joined up, and he arrived in New Spain, Mexico, to us today, of course, in 1763. The Colegio de Santa Cruz was one of 21 such Franciscan institutions in the Americas at that time. Now, what were these colegios? They weren't colleges in the sense we might think of today. They were instead elite missionary training centers. Santa Cruz was the first one to have been founded in 1683. Why 1683? Well, because it was founded in response to the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680. That event was an ecclesial eye-opener. It showed that the missionaries that were being sent out to faraway fields like New Mexico were simply inadequate to the task. The colegios were therefore founded to form much more effective missionary friars that were prepared, both physically and intellectually, to wage and win spiritual battle, whether in urban centers, in outlying villages, or on distant frontiers. That was the kind of training that Garces received at the Colegio de Santa Cruz. It was rigorous. Now, while there, he did not distinguish himself as a scholar. As I found in researching and writing this book, he was a terrible writer, quite frankly, may have suffered from what we would now call dyslexia. One of the most nonlinear thinkers you'll ever meet in the pages of history. But what he did show at the Colegio was that he had a winning way about him. He was charming. People gravitated to his simplicity and his authenticity, especially children and the poor. Later, as we shall see, he would prove to have incredible physical stamina and powers of endurance as well. So you combine these qualities with the excellent training he received at the Colegio, and you can see that Garces had the makings of a good missionary. Garces was at the Colegio for 4 years, and perhaps he would have stayed longer, but in 1767, something dramatic happened. The Jesuits were expelled from all of Spain's dominions. And that meant, as this map shows that you're looking at here, that a lot of mission stations were now vacated. No one in New Spain wanted empty missions because they were regarded as crucial institutions for the Hispanicization of indigenous groups. So the Franciscans of Santa Cruz were assigned to replace the Jesuits in the mission field of Pimeria Alta, and that would be the far northern dots you see on this map. Pimeria Alta, the northern land of the Pimas, consisted essentially of the northern part of today's Sonora and southern Arizona up to the Gila River. The Spanish basically had not gone north of the Gila in what is now Arizona. The northernmost, most exposed, most dangerous post in all of the Pimeria Alta was a place called San Javier del Bac, which I'm sure many of you have been to today. That church wasn't there at the time. Francisco Garces arrived in 1768. So as I said, the beautiful church that stands at San Javier del Bac today had not yet been built when Garces arrived. Instead, there was a leaky mud and post structure, a few church items, including this baptismal font to the left, the leftmost image on this slide, a few dozen native O'odham families, notionally living at and tied to the mission, and an unknown number of quite unfriendly Apaches to the north and east. The Jesuits who had preceded Garces at San Javier had not been very successful. To the extent possible, most of them stayed within a few miles of the mission, so dangerous. Some were laughably poorly matched to the conditions that prevailed. One, a Father Ségisser, Philippe Ségisser, was a Swiss nobleman by birth. He wrote home pretty quickly after he arrived at San Javier, asking for things like cookie presses and butter churns. Needless to say, such items were not very useful in the real conditions of San Javier del Bac. So here we have Garces at San Javier del Bac in 1768. The usual thing to do would be to invite/lure in surrounding natives with food and gifts, preach to them, baptize those who assented to such, and then induce them, possibly with the help of a few soldiers, to live a common life at the mission while receiving further religious instruction. Garces had other ideas. For one thing, he simply did not have it in him the ability to command. He was a lover, not a leader, and his nature apparently rather quickly became obvious to the O'odham. They took to him, and soon they invited him to visit their outlying villages. That request did comport with Garces's nature, for he was both energetic and curious. Plus, one of the viceroy's instructions to the missionaries had been for them to explore their areas, get to know the people, the flora, and the fauna, and report back. Most missionaries interpreted this instruction to mean the area within a few miles of my mission. With the O'odham's encouragement, Garces interpreted it to mean the vast, unknown, and unmapped and stupendously dangerous land to my north and west. So soon he was on his first entrada, or journey of exploration. So this is where he went on that first entrada. You can see San Javier del Bac there in the lower right corner. And what Garces discovered was that the O'odham, they would be known as Pimas and Papagos to the Spaniards. The O'odham that lived to the north and west were disposed to be friendly. They were farmers, and they had some mutually beneficial contact with Spanish missionaries for decades. One of those missionaries was the Jesuit Eusebio Kino, the man who had founded many of the Pimeria Alta's missions. So in 1768, Garces more or less followed in Kino's footsteps. Taking a couple of native guides from San Javier del Bac, he made perhaps a 250-mile circuit north and west over the course of a few weeks. Now, understand, this sort of thing wasn't done. It certainly wasn't done without soldiers or without reasonably adequate supplies. Garces did not have, and apparently didn't much want, either of those things. As he discovered, and perhaps had initially intuited, traveling light and with no other Spaniards quickly gained him respect among the O'odham. They greeted him warmly, fed him well, and listened while he talked about things that were surely difficult to understand. Garces, for his part, immediately liked them, as he liked almost everyone. He keenly observed their agricultural and fishing methods, he probed as to their religious beliefs, and he learned about their alliances. Finally, he discovered that they were well disposed toward the Spanish, mainly, as he knew, because they saw an alliance with them as offering a bulwark against their implacable Apache foes. 2 years later, in 1770, Garces undertook the same route, but expanded it. Ostensibly, he started out on this entrada because people were dying of a smallpox epidemic, and he was asked to come offer baptism to the dying. But he was also itching to explore again, to discover what lay más allá. On this trip, he was told a tale that had traveled several hundred miles on the Indian grapevine, a tale of soldiers and people who looked like Garces marching up the coast of the faraway ocean. The story was, of course, about Junipero Serra and the so-called sacred expedition that had led to the founding of missions at San Diego and Monterey in 1769. Garces reported the story to the leading military authority in the Pimeria Alta, Juan Bautista de Anza, who was based at the Presidio in Tubac. For them, it had a special importance. The story revealed that news traveled by land from the coast to where they were, which meant people traveled by land from the coast to where they were. And you might think, of course they did. But here's the thing. The Spaniards didn't know how to do that. At that time, no one knew how to successfully cross the forbidding desert country that lay between those poles. That is, no Spaniard knew how. No Spaniard knew who lived in all those areas, or what they were like, or what the land was like, or where water and forage might be found. But they knew it wasn't liable to be flowing with milk and honey. Because no one knew of an overland route, there was a problem. The new missions in California had to be supplied by coast rather than by, mule trains overland. The other way to do it would have been take a mule train all the way up Baja California, which was incredibly long and incredibly difficult. And so taking everything by boat was tough because it took a long time and it was a very dangerous trip. And lots of people inevitably ended up with scurvy and some of them died. So Garces and Anza realized that it would be really, really useful to find a route that ran roughly from today's Tucson to today's San Diego. Basically, to accomplish what you would do today on I-8 and I-10. Garces took it upon himself to try to find the way. So in 1771, traveling as he nearly always did, without any soldiers or Spanish companion of any kind, he ended up barely surviving a midsummer trek along today's Camino del Diablo, Devil's Road, from San Javier del Bac to today's Yuma. The map here, you can see he starts in San Javier del Bac, there on the right, and you can see he kind of cuts through the desert, swings down, and then travels along what is still today El Camino del Diablo. Still today, extremely hot and dry road that goes through incredibly inhospitable land. No Spaniard ever took it, certainly not on his own, but Garces survived. At Yuma, where the Gila and Colorado rivers meet, he met and befriended the Quechan Indians who lived in and controlled the region, including their headman, a tall, intelligent, asthmatic man the Spanish knew as Salvador Palma. That relationship would become a very important one. From Yuma, Garces managed to make his way across the confusing lagoons and dunes and desert west of that place to the base of the mountains that separate California's coast from its inland. But that was far enough. He had gotten past the worst of it, and he could see where a workable route to the coast might go. He makes his way back, and this 1771 entrada, when it becomes known, was regarded as a major achievement. When word reached the Spanish royal officials, they were excited. Opening a road from Sonora to Alta California would be an important strategic victory. Garces conferred with Anza, and together they pitched the viceroy the idea of leading a small expedition from San Javier del Bac to Monterey. Their idea was accepted and funded, and in 1774, they accomplished the deed. It was not without drama. I obviously don't have time to tell you all these stories. They're in the book. But one of the enduring images from that entrada is Anza and his men crawling on their hands and knees to reach water tanks high up in one of the beautiful bare ranges just north of today's international border. Another is the men wandering lost and exhausted among the dunes to the south and west of today's Yuma. Garces having accidentally led them on a wild goose chase to find a native village that was no longer there. Still another enduring image is the expedition arriving at San Gabriel Mission to the east of today's LA, to the utter surprise and delight of the unhappy, impoverished, and nearly famished friars who lived there. Garces would end up giving clothes to Father Lasuen, who is destined one day to become the president of the California missions. And one more image, Garces journeying to San Diego through drenching rain and sloppy mud to plead with Father Sarah for much needed supplies. They ended up spending Easter together, and Sarah ended up giving almost no useful supplies. He had none to spare. Well, Anza and his men made it to Monterey. They all made it back, and when it was all over, the expedition's success was hailed in Mexico City. Anza and Garces were heroes. What had been unknown was now known. But it was on to the next job, and that was to lead a second expedition. This would be a big one. Its purpose would be to lead the first non-military settlers to Alta California. For this expedition, and I know this map is very small, but to give you a sense of where Garces went in this time frame. This expedition, which set out from Tubac in October of 1775, there is a National Historic Trail. You can look it up online, and you can follow it in your car through Arizona and California. Suffice to say that the second Anza expedition was an amazing success. There was almost no trouble with natives along the way. The expedition ended up with more people in it when it arrived in Monterey than when it left Sonora, thanks to babies born along the way. One of them was born on a chilly Christmas Eve under the stars in the desert west of Yuma. He was named Salvador, of course. Garces was a big part of this expedition, but he wasn't with it on Christmas Eve 1775. His orders had been to stay behind in Yuma and explore the area. Once again, he interpreted his instructions broadly, to say the least. His most epic entrada was at hand. First, he explored the Colorado River area south of Yuma to the river's mouth. Everywhere he went, he brokered peace deals. Interethnic warfare was endemic there. And he preached. I invite you to try to procure the edition of his diary titled A Record of Travels in Arizona and California. Usually you can get it from used book sellers online. It's not terribly expensive, but it makes for wonderful reading. Let me just read you a selection from Garces' entry on December 22nd, 1775. He is camped on the lower Colorado River just above its mouth, which he was the first Spaniard to get to on foot, by the way, with some Cocopa Indians. That's what Garces writes. They were very agreeable to me, and in order to amuse me, brought a little girl about 10 years old, who, covering only the absolute minimum, threw her right leg over her left shoulder, took a stick in her hand, and in this fashion danced, hopped, and ran about afterward, repeating with the left leg. This brought great shouts of laughter from the mountain Indians and the Cocopas of the rancheria where I was staying. One could tell that these poor folk had never seen domesticated animals, especially mules, for they greeted ours as if they were persons. At any rate, on 2 or 3 different nights, they compassionately removed the mules' hobbles and took them to another rancheria to eat squash. On another day, the jack mule got stuck in the mud. When the Indians saw that he couldn't free himself, they all ran to help him, took him out in their arms, and carried him to the fire to get warm. For me, there's something deeply moving about that passage. After he returned from the Colorado River's mouth to Yuma, Garces decided that a better northern route between Sonora and Monterey needed to be found, as well as a direct route from Monterey to Santa Fe. So why not do that right now? He took a native guide or two, some food and gifts for the Indians he would meet along the way, and he headed north. I don't have time to tell you the whole astonishing story, but in summary, he went north to today's Needles, liberating two girls who had been taken as slaves along the way. He befriended the powerful Mojaves, something later American explorers were quite unable to do. He crossed the forbidding Mojave Desert over to Mission San Gabriel, went from there into the great Central Valley of California, traveled some miles north of Bakersfield, recrossed the Mojave Desert to Needles, and finally went from Needles to the Hopi's Oribe village, stopping to descend into the Grand Canyon along the way. Just a little trip on your own in the middle of nowhere in 1776. There may even be a pictographic record of him etched into the rocks in two locations near the very southern tip of Nevada. You can see these two glyphs here, one on the left and one on the right, that are thought potentially to represent Garces. On this trip, as on his previous ones, everyone Garces met seemed to love him, and he loved them. One of his colleagues, Father Pedro Font, said Garces was like an Indian himself. He would sit around the fire for hours into the early morning, eating what his native hosts ate, talking with them, getting to know them as best he could. Now, since this is the Grand Canyon Historical Society, let's pause for a bit on Garces' time in northern Arizona, in or near the canyon. I find it very interesting and revealing what Garces had to say about some of the people and landscapes he encountered along the way. So let me read you a couple of excerpts from his diary to give you a sense of the world he was encountering and how he processed it. So this is June 10th, probably near the northern tip of the Peacock Mountains in northwestern Arizona. I halted at an abandoned rancheria. My companions set fire to a hovel, raising clouds of smoke to see if there were any Indians near. None appeared, so we went on eastward. Soon, one of my companions saw at the foot of a tree two children who, when asked where their father was, said he would soon come, and he did, about 10 o'clock the next morning, with his wife, greeting us with pleasure. The man, seeing my mule, asked for it to bring in a buck that he had left dead. It is remarkable how these Indians share whatever they get from hunting. Though the amount be small, they share it with everyone. On this occasion, before loading the deer on, he cut it up and gave half to the captain who accompanied me. The days I stopped there, they both gave me of their portions. 10 days after this encounter, June 20th, Garces gets to the canyon. He becomes the first European to descend to Supai. Now, a Flagstaff-based former park ranger and writer named Scott Thibony has studied Garces' route much more than I have. And he says that Garces did not descend by today's Supai Trail, but rather by an older route. Perhaps one of you would know which one that might have been. At any rate, here's what Garces wrote. I went along a narrow way that I called the New Canfran. The Canfran apparently was a trail in the Pyrenees that was particularly tenuous and frightening. It was some 3 handbreadths wide, with a very high cliff on one side, and on the other, a hideous abyss. What came next was worse. I had to get down from my mule and the Indians from their horses in order to descend a wooden ladder. I was not afraid, since I saw how joyous they were at my coming, that is, the Supai Indians, inside the canyon, and that they were accepting willingly the peace proposed by me with the Spaniards and the Mojaves. They urged me so persistently that I had to stop there 5 days. During this time, they treated me to deer meat and beef, maize, beans, greens, and mescal, with all of which they were well provided. It pleased me much to see that at daybreak the husband would go out with his wife and older children to work their fields, taking along the tools they needed, such as digging sticks, hatchets, and grub hoes. All these they get from Moki, the name of the Spaniards gave of where the Hopi Indians lived. They are decently clothed and are fond of remnants of red cloth, which they call Spanish because it comes from New Mexico. In all my travels, I have seen no better natural stronghold. Indeed, where would he have seen a better natural stronghold, right, than Supai? In short, this first meeting that we know of between the Europeans and Indigenous within the Grand Canyon's walls went about as well as it possibly could. That was typical of Garces' encounters with Indians. Indeed, he would return to Supai on his way back to the lower Colorado River in mid-July. On that occasion, he would stay for 6 days and amuse his gracious hosts by assigning them each the name of a Catholic saint. After his descent to Supai in June, Thigh Bunny figures, Garces came back to the canyon rim by way of the Topocoba Trail, while his horses were led out by way of Moki Trail Canyon. Thigh Bunny believes that from there, Garces and his Havasupai guides made their way to a much-used camp above Dripping Springs, and that Garces walked from that place across Eremita Mesa to Yuma Point, just a mile or so northwest as the crow flies from Hermit's Rest today. From here, wrote Garces on June 26, 1776, I saw that in a very large mountain range extending from southeast to northwest and blue with distance, a deep passage was cut, steep-sided like a man-made trough, through which the Colorado River enters these lands. I called it the Puerto de Bucareli. Bucareli was the viceroy at the time. Garces was describing a view of the river cutting through the Kaibab uplift. It is the earliest written description we have of such a view. Over the next week or so, Garces and his guides followed the old Moki Trail until they arrived at Oribe. Here, things did not go so well as they had at Supai in the Grand Canyon. July 4th, 1776 was a momentous day, not just for the colonial patriots, but for Garces, as it was the first and only time he failed to establish friendly relations with the native group. Let's read once more from his diary. He is in Oribe village, in a corner of the plaza that is still there today and pictured in this old photograph from George Morton James. And he's trying to wait out the Hopis' unfriendliness. As soon as day began to break, I heard singing and dancing along the streets. The dance passed the place where I was, and I saw some Indians with feather ornaments on their heads and other finery, making a din with small sticks on a shallow wooden basin, in company with flutes. Many followed them and stopped here and there to dance. When the sun was up, a great throng moved toward me and made me fear for my life. In the lead came 4 of the principal men, the tallest of whom demanded of me, with a smile, "Why have you come here? Don't stay. Go back to your own land." I made signs to them to be seated, but they did not wish to do so. I stood up, crucifix in hand, and partly in Yuma, partly in Yavapai, partly in Spanish, and with signs, which are the best language, I made known to them the path of my journey, the nations I had seen, and those that had passed the crucifix from hand to hand and had been good to me. I said, moreover, that I cherished the Hopis, and that I came to tell them that God is in heaven, and that the crucified was God, Jesus Christ, who was good. To this, an old man, contorting his features, said in Spanish, "No, no." At that, I said, "Fetch my mule." When it was brought and my things were loaded on, I mounted, and with a smile on my face, praising their pueblo and their dress, I left, surrounded by all the crowd until I was beyond the houses. After Garces left the Hopis' homeland, he slowly made his way back to San Javier del Bac. He had been on the road for 10 months and traveled 2,000 miles, most of that time in the company only of native guides or no one at all. Also, with few to no supplies, no guns, no maps, nada. It was incredible. When word of his journey reached officials in New Spain, most of whom thought he was dead, Garces became a frontier celebrity. No one could believe what he had achieved. With the help of Father Font, he made this map, and it dramatically expanded Spain's understanding of North American geography. He reported on peoples that were not known to have existed. Indeed, he was the first European many natives had seen. And he argued for the placement of about a dozen or so more missions on the northern frontier. Garces was always arguing, and passionately, for more missions. Alas, here our story starts to take a less happy turn, for the Spanish at least. The key to Spain's control over the route to California, and this part of the northwestern frontier, was clearly Yuma, where the Gila and Colorado rivers joined. Thanks to Garces, the Spanish had befriended Salvador Palma and the Quechens who controlled that location and were the dominant players in the region. So this was where new missions and a presidio needed to be placed. Garces was to lead the effort. But things didn't go as planned. For lots of reasons, it took far too long for Spain to establish the new institutions. Garces finally arrived in 1779. By this time, there was a strong anti-Spanish faction among the Quechuans. Garces and his 3 priest companions labored as best they could until, in July 1781, a group of Spanish settlers arrived from Sonora on their way to found a new settlement, a place that would become known as Los Angeles. This large group of settlers had a large number of livestock. The livestock proceeded to eat and trample precious Quechan crops. The Quechans complained. The Spanish mainly ignored them, and Quechan rebels saw their chance. On July 17th, 1781, they rose up, and over the course of 2 or 3 days, they slaughtered the Spanish soldiers and settlers and took dozens of women and children captive. Garces and his companion, Father Juan Antonio de Berenice, were in the mission church when it all started. They helped those inside make their escape and ministered to the dying. Finally, on July 21st, as the 2 priests were drinking hot chocolate in the hut of a friendly Christian Quechan woman, they were found by the rebels and told to come out and be killed. Garces responded, "Can we finish our chocolate first?" This request was denied. Garces and Berenice stepped outside and were clubbed to death. The so-called Yuma crossing would remain closed to the Spanish for many years, and Garces would slowly fade into obscurity. Today, the 2 major monuments to Garces' memory are a large, handsome statue in a grimy Bakersfield traffic circle, that's the one on the left, and a statue in front of St. Thomas Indian Mission just across the river from Yuma in Winter Haven, California. That's the one on the right. The church there is located on the precise hill where was located Garces' mission church. It is where he was saying Mass when Quechan rebels attacked. Neither monument is much visited, of course, except by sickos like Wayne Raney, who I know has been to at least the St. Thomas one. And except to borderland scholars, Garces is almost totally unknown. But I do think he mattered, and I'll give you 3 reasons why. First, he argued for and modeled a new way of missionizing, one that was more patient and more culturally attuned, as we would say today. In a letter written in 1772, he states how new missions ought to be founded. He recommends that missionaries be patient, subtle, and non-threatening, not talking about great harvests, nor of the baptism of adults, nor bringing into subjection others than the children. Rather than projecting grand designs, he wrote, let them speak by their deeds, notice no annoyance, and ask for no service. In short, Garces anticipated a new approach to what theologians call missiology, an approach that would become standard practice in the 19th and 20th centuries. Second, Garces made contributions to anthropology and ethnology that were real and lasting. Alfred Kroeber, the great cultural anthropologist, cited Garces frequently in his pioneering early 20th century works on California's indigenous peoples. Studies of the Quechans, Chemehuevis, Mojaves, Havasupais, and other groups as they existed at the time of contact, some of them no longer extant, do the same. In fact, Peter Whiteley, curator of North American ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History, has just published a monograph that delves deeply into Garces' reports. And third, Garces may have been more successful in his missionary work than either he or anyone else initially thought, or that many still think. At the very end of the 1800s, after the United States had come into possession of Arizona Territory and Phoenix had been established, and the Apaches had been brought under military control, the Franciscan order returned to St. Mary's Church in Phoenix. They started to fan out into the desert to serve the natives there, and they were astonished to discover that the O'odham had preserved many sacred items from the missions decades earlier. They had preserved in memory certain prayers and scraps of doctrine. They had even reconstructed or constructed chapels where they incorporated what they recalled of Christianity with their traditional beliefs and practices. The Franciscans experienced great success in connecting with them and did not fail to recall the pioneering work of Father Garces. In fact, today, in the beautiful desert lands of southern Arizona, where Garces once preached, the Tohono O'odham Reservation is perhaps the most Catholic region of America, with 30 or 40 brilliantly whitewashed chapels, like this one, standing in little villages and an estimated 85% of residents being Catholic. Almost no one knows that. It's not a fact that fits our dominant narratives. But as we mark the 250th anniversary of the Anza expedition and of a little thing called the Declaration of Independence, perhaps we can make more room in our national story for figures like Francisco Garces, forgotten men and women whose deeds challenge our imaginations and upset our expectations, men and women whose lives contribute new to our complex and crazy American story. Thank you. I am done.
Wow, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was really excellent, and I appreciate your uh, uh, spending a little bit more time on the Grand Canyon portion of Garce's story. We are the Grand Canyon Historical Society, but I really appreciate that.
Of course.
Um, we do have one question so far, and that is from a listener who is asking, what drew you to Garces for your research in the first place?
So, yeah, that's good because it gives me a chance to call out another book that people might want to know about. I found on the shelves of an independent bookstore in La Jolla, California, a book called Franciscan Frontiersmen, which the title just sort of, what is that? It's by a man named Robert Kittle. It was published by the University of Oklahoma Press, I think in around 2017, 2018 in there. Um, and Kittle, one of the main people he talks about in the book is Garces. A couple of chapters devoted to him. And it just, he was so he was somebody I just couldn't believe there wasn't a full biography of. I wanted to read more because he was so different than so many of the other missionaries, which I don't really have time to go into in a presentation like this. But if anybody's ever read the Diary of Pedro Font, and that book is also available, his Diary of the Anza Expedition, the second Anza Expedition, you can see major differences. Font speaks, and I'm not castigating him for this, but like you'd expect an 18th century Spaniard, maybe a Spanish priest in particular, to speak. He's always talking about the how dirty the natives are and how ugly they are and the stupid things they do and all this sort of very sort of a negative language, right? And Garces just didn't. I mean, it's amazing for his time. He rarely was critical. Really only when he was kind of pushed, he gets really stressed out, kind of pushed to the edge. And so that's remarkable for anybody ever to be kind of, ahead of their time, so to speak, and to be just so humane and so charitable. Um, so I found out that the great historian Herbert Bolton always wanted to write a biography of Garces and never got to it. Another great historian of the borderlands named John Kessel had put together notes for a biography of Garces and never got to it. Another man had done the same, and I think he died, I think, before he could finish. So it was the field was clear. The only problem was my Spanish is mediocre at best, and Garces's handwriting is terrible. But fortunately, Bolton and Kessel and some others had translated into English almost all of his letters and his diaries, and they're just in the archives at the University of California at Berkeley and some other places. And then what I didn't have, the editor of the series this book is in, Rosemary Beebe, translated, and another woman named Constanza. Uh, um, uh, I'm blanking on Constanza's last name right now. Did the rest, and so I was able to do it. That's a long answer to that question, but I was giving time for there to be another question, Wayne. That was strategic.
Uh,
Yeah, I think someone else has a question here.
Jeremy, this is Tom Sulpizio. I had a couple of questions that I came up with during your talk, which is marvelous. As you know, I'm very interested in the Spanish missions throughout the Southwest. But I was kind of curious. I wasn't aware that there is a monument to Garces in Bakersfield, and I'm wondering why that of all places. First of all, there was no Bakersfield until the
Yeah,
Anglo explorer, the American explorer Baker himself. There are
yeah,
many Bakers here in the West.
yeah.
Why did that monument end up there? Was there a mission built?
No, there wasn't. He was there. So the Kern River runs through Bakersfield,
Correct.
and he describes very vividly in his diary of that big entrada, that last one I talked about in 75, 76,
Hmm.
his crossing and recrossing of the Kern River. Um, I think just that sometime in the late 19th, maybe early part of the 20th century, as Bakersfield was getting going and people were looking for a usable European past, that somebody you discovered that Garces had been there and decided to sort of make him their guy. That's what I think, Tom. That it was like he was somebody who he was an explorer who had been here and nobody else really had. So I think that's why. But nothing of note really happened there other than he was the first European to report on his explorations of the Central Valley. Probably not the first one in the Great
Hmm.
Central Valley. That was probably Pedro Fages, Fages, who
Okay.
was a Spanish military official, but he was the first to report on it.
Well,
Garces.
it's the one monument I could check out with a day trip. I'm not too
Yeah,
far from Bakersfield, so that's why it
yeah.
was.
It's a very cool monument. It's like an Art Deco
Mhm.
modernist kind of 1920s, I want to say it was done.
Mhm.
Um, but it's in a kind of a weird spot.
There are other comments and questions. I'll let others go, and then I can come back if there's time.
Sure.
So, Wayne or Davey, do you want to recite the other comments?
Yeah, I can pick up here. Uh, One of our fellow members is asking if Scott Thibany has published his research somewhere.
Wayne, you probably know the answer to that better than I do.
I think Scott has written about it, but whether it's been published or not, Scott keeps a lot of personal notes that he shares with
Yeah,
friends.
right.
He does have two or three books that are published, and
Hmm.
some of the material about Garce's route into Supai may appear in those, but certainly he has written about it, whether it's been published or not.
Yeah, I have what he gave me, which looked like it was not published, his sort of
Mhm.
account of reconstructing the trail that Garces took in
Yeah.
along the south rim of the Grand Canyon and into and out of Supai. So if the person wants to drop me a line, Wayne, or probably you as well, I'm sure we can share. I'm sure Scott wouldn't mind if we share that with them.
I'll jump in. Wayne, doesn't Scott have a audio piece he does on KNAU, the PBS station at Northern
Yes, he
Nebraska?
does a monthly thing called Canyon
Mhm.
Commentaries, and he
Correct.
may have actually spoken about that. He's been doing it for a number of years.
Hmm. That's what I was
We'll
thinking.
just put this person in touch with Scott, and Scott can
Yeah.
do whatever he wants.
I do want to just highlight the fact that July 4th, 1776 in this country is usually associated with Philadelphia.
Yeah,
But to think that a European who was keeping a written record was at the Hopi Mesas,
yeah. The
sort of
oldest
begging
continuously
for
inhabited village in
friendship.
North America at that time. Exactly.
Exactly, on the very same time and the same moment.
Yeah.
And that just leads me to an idea that when I heard your first talk and then just finished reading the book, um, what a wonderful job you did explaining both the benefits and the detractions from both sides of this equation,
Hmm.
Spanish colonialism plus Native Americans.
Hmm.
And we really get a sense for the Native Americans, the many different tribes that lived along the lower Colorado River.
Yeah.
Um, if Garces wasn't in the title of your book, it could be, you know,
Yeah.
in a way, a native history of the inhabitants of the lower Colorado, and we really learn a lot about it. So I just want to say to any listeners out there that
Yeah.
this is a fantastic book on Southwestern history and geography, and it just draws you right into those times 250 years ago.
Yeah. I give them the Native American groups, that is short shrift in this talk because I'm trying to
Yeah,
compress so much into 45 minutes, but thanks for saying that. I tried it. I did my best. Somebody who is really an expert, an actual anthropologist or ethnologist could do better for sure. And it's amazing though that some of these, as far as I could tell from the scholarly literature, there's just not much about some of these groups that he encountered, and many of them disappeared before sort of scholars got around to documenting things, right, and doing sort of the anthropological work that would be done today. So Garces is an interesting source. Obviously, you have to read all Spanish sources about Native Americans with, a filter, right, and try to determine what's happening here versus necessarily on the surface what they're telling you is happening. Um, But Garces in particular, I think is a fairly it's a pretty trustworthy source. He's willing to criticize Spanish, you know, uh,
Mhm.
things. And he's very willing to give praise to indigenous groups, too, more so than maybe some of his missionary peers.
Well, the way that he could wander into these groups and be
Yeah,
accepted by them, and not only be accepted, but then trusted by them
yeah,
and sort of made one of them. And even his Spanish contemporaries mentioned how well he fit in. So
yeah,
I think Garces was one of the good guys. I'm just
yeah,
wondering if you have any thoughts on why maybe people like Kino and Escalante and Dominguez loom larger in
yeah,
our view today. Garces, at least to me, is certainly their equal, if not better. And I just wonder why
yeah.
they might be better represented historically.
That's a good question about Kino. I don't know the answer to that, except I wonder if the Jesuits more energetically promoted him
Hmm.
than the Franciscans did Garces. They never really haven't. The Franciscans haven't very energetically promoted Garces. Sarah kind of was the focus of their sort of efforts, to sort of make their history continue to be visible. Uh, so Kino's a good question, Wayne. Dominguez, Escalante and Dominguez, I think. Um, has that diary been more available? Maybe. Obviously,
I
you got the
think,
good look of having regions named after you. We need a Garce. If we had a Garces National Forest, I think that would make a big difference, right?
yeah. And it's true that a lot of the things that Dominguez and Escalante named, those names remain on the modern landscape
Yeah,
more
Yes.
so
yeah,
than what Garces
yeah.
did.
Garces left no toponymics that there's one I think I may have found in Western Arizona. He does have a little connection with the Escalante expedition. He when he on July 4th, 1776, he sent or he when he realized he was not going to go on to New Mexico, which was his original plan, he sent a letter to he didn't know who he was sending it to, but to whoever the missionary was in charge of Zuni. And I said, "Here I came. They're very unfriendly, and I'm headed back. But I got here. I've just we know now basically how to get. You know how to get to Hopi land, and I know how to get here. So we have this figured out in so many words." Um, and that was taken to Dominguez, and was part of the reason my understanding from the literature. I think ultimately it's part of the reason why they decided on a northern route to go north of the Grand Canyon, and try to get to California that way rather than the southern route. And that's why they also asked about Garces along the way, multiple occasions, because they really were wondering, like, maybe he's still out here wandering around.
Well, maybe for those of us that are Colorado Plateau centric,
Yeah,
Dominguez and Escalante would loom larger. And
yeah.
really, Garces was mostly a Sonoran and Mojave
He's a
Desert
desert
guy.
guy.
So
That's right. That's
maybe
exactly right.
that connection to
But
that.
he
But
hasn't gotten his due, and I don't know exactly why. I think obviously in my book, I'm hoping it helps a little bit with that. And then we're going to do a volume of his diaries as well, all of which are out of print, three of which have never before appeared in English. So I think
oh,
that will be valuable as well.
well,
So
I can't recommend the book enough. And I
I
think
can't
Tom has
raise,
another comment. But thank
yeah.
you so much for this
Thank
I
you.
was
presentation.
looking for there's a raising hand symbol on some of these uh, online applications. I don't see it on our control panel, so I'm just going to jump in. And two things about the indigenous. So the general discussion is there's 11 indigenous groups who touch on that northern Colorado on Grand Canyon and the Colorado River region.
Mm.
And you mentioned, of course, two of them, the Hopi and you mentioned Hopi and
Have a soup eyes.
Havasupai. Do you know if uh, Father Garces met any of the other native groups? Because there was the
Absolutely.
biggest one
Yeah.
is Navajo, of course.
Yeah, he did
Diné.
not have encounters with Navajo, as far as I
Okay.
know. With the
Or Diné.
Wallapai, he did.
Okay. Mhm.
With Mojaves, extensive with the Mojaves. Um, Obviously with if we're just saying the
An-
canyon area, so Mojaves is
yeah,
touching
Anastasi.
on it. Yeah, and it's not
The
would have been
Wallapais.
yeah, the Wallapais. Um,
Uh-huh.
think that would have been it in terms of the
Havasupai.
canyon. In terms of the canyon, you have Havasupai, Wallapai,
Right.
Hopi, and Mojave if we're kind of stretching a point.
I don't know if Mojave is one of the 11
Yeah, I
because
think I'm
it's
probably
further
stretching a point
west.
there.
You're
So,
stretching them a little bit.
yeah, yeah,
The second one is related, which is he went on these entradas or expeditions on his own without any, military accompaniment. How did he communicate? All these indigenous people have separate languages. The
yeah,
famous Navajo language is the one that's the code
yeah,
breaker. So how did
yeah.
he manage to
It
communicate
wasn't
since
easy, I don't think.
they
So
didn't speak
as he says
Spanish?
in that diary extract I read,
Mhm.
he picked up. He was a
Okay.
surprisingly good linguist for someone who
Wow.
wasn't a
Had to
good. I think he
be.
was an oral learner and not a kind
Right.
of written learner. So I think he picked up languages pretty well.
Had to. He
He
had
often
to.
did have a native guide with him. Now, they may not know the languages either, of course. I
Hmm.
mean, the Spanish thought, well, they have a better shot than we do, basically, was kind of the idea.
Right.
Um, but sign language, and then you just use scraps of other languages and
I
try
see.
to piece it together that way. Yeah, there
Yeah.
are times, many times, especially like in the Central Valley, he had no idea what was going on, and he says so
Right.
in his diary.
So,
Mhm.
of course, Anza, you mentioned places named after. Um,
Yeah, Anza gets a lot.
Anza gets a lot. There's a
Yeah,
big, there's a state park, Anza Borrego
yeah,
State Park east of San Diego, which
yeah,
is pretty well known
yeah,
and spectacular in its own right.
yeah, yeah. Anza gets a lot because they not
Doesn't
so
get his
much.
due. Didn't get his due.
No, it's our job to rescue him from obscurity.
Well, you did a fantastic job. I can't wait to read the book itself, and with your lecture here in the back of my mind, it'll be even more useful to read the research you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks to all of you for tuning in.